Hey everyone, this is Deadpool Negative, finally back with what has become the second chapter of what I call my Vince Giarrano trilogy. Basically, it's like three of my favorite comic books of all time were drawn in part, at least, by artist Vince Giarrano, who left comics about 30 years ago and is now a successful painter. But I think he drew three of my favorite comics of all time, and I'd like to highlight them. Now, I already talked about Badlands, which is actually my favorite comic of all time. The JFK murder mystery, so to speak, written by Stephen Grant. And there's also Fool Killer, which he only did finishes for half of, but I do want to get to that eventually. It's Fool Killer is not only Steve Gerber's best comic book, but the best comic book Marvel ever published, in my opinion. And believe me, I've read enough rough Marvel comics to feel that statement is definitive. But what I want to talk about today has got to be one of the strangest comics ever published. And before that, I want to get into how I discovered it briefly. Back in the 90s, whenever I go to the shore in the 90s, up to the early 2000s, when I believe around 2004, they went into business. There was a book bookstore chain called Atlantic Books, and they basically had books that were taken out of circulation, used books that didn't sell. They were basically a wholesaler, and they said a lot of books. I remember buying a copy of Mason Dixon. There was it Mason Dixon. I don't know about that, but just you'd find a lot of crap there, and you'd also find some gems like the long out of print screenplay for I, Robot by Harlan Ellison, Isaac Asimov, which they should still make into a movie if they can figure out a way to make it work. I mean, if like, but they would always have a comic rack, and it would always fill with like late '80s stuff, like stuff, mainly stuff from DC, mainly stuff from New Format. In fact, you could always find copy after copy after copy of Sonic Disruptors on this comics rack. It was hilarious. And I think if I had a gazillion dollars in my own comic book company, I'd go to Mike Barron and say, "Why don't you finish Sonic Disruptors?" And then he'd probably shoot me. But one thing I do clearly remember picking up an issue of this Haywire. This specific issue, actually, from Atlantic Books. This shows one of the villains of the series, White Lotus, and in shadow, the quote unquote hero of the book. Now, Haywire was created by Michael Fleisher, created by Giarrano and Michael Fleisher. Now, Mr. Fleischer is not one of the most beloved writers in the industry for various reasons. I mean, he was also not one of the most likable people in the industry. I could base that on his own semi-autobiographical novel, The Shambler, which, what a book. But at his peak, he was a solid storyteller, and I think had one or two would come up with a great idea once in a while, or at least a crazy idea. And sometimes he'd come up with an idea that he should not have put into paper. And if you've ever read his other novel, you know what that is. But mostly people know him from the lawsuit and his run on the Spectre, and how that contributed to the lawsuit with the Comics Journal and Harlan Ellison, and how that all just spilled out. In any case, Mr. Fleischer passed away. This was at the tail end of his career in comics. The series lasted 13 issues from 88 to 89. Most of Andrew Helfer is the credited editor, and I've confirmed this with Kevin Dooley, the credited assistant editor. Mr. Dooley did most of the work editing the title because Helfer's office was completely swamped at the time. Kevin Dooley, of course, is most known for the guy who said to Gerard Jones, "Yeah, this isn't working with your Green Lantern revamp. Let's bring in this Ron Mars guy and see what his idea is." In any case, I can't really say it's a great comic book. It's one of my favorites, but I wouldn't say it's great. It's got a lot of problems that Fleischer had near the end of his career, which, despite its relentless imagination, he was also clearly blocked, and things don't even make sense. The final reveals are just, what the... Okay, I mean, I get that. It was more like the final reveals were like, I gotta wrap this up. Even though, like, according to Dooley in the last issue, like, the story was always meant to go to the direction it did, and it was meant to be told in chapters. All right, I'm gonna shoot you the premise. Haywire, the title character, is a killer robot that's actually somebody, one of that's actually a human inside a killer robot. You don't realize that until a few issues in. And Haywire is, the human inside Haywire is a man with dissociative identity disorder. So there's the original Steve Majorsky, a man, a drifter living in New York City, who's basically trying to figure out what happened to his father. You see his memories of his father's murder in the very first scene of the comic. His other personality is Alex Kingman, a highly successful PR firm executive, which is one of the things hard to swallow. Like, Alex Kingman has his blackouts and never figures out that his other side is like, it's weird. But that back was 1988. You could get away with that. And Haywire, the killer robot suit. Haywire reacts to crime in angry ways. And so we get this really strange snaking story over 13 issues. Steve Majorsky keeps wandering, trying to figure out what happened to his father, ignoring the only person in his life that's really connecting with him, his girlfriend. Alex Kingman is trying to figure out where the hell his blackouts are coming from, and Haywire just wants to smash criminals. That's all Haywire wants to do, is just beat up. It triggers itself when it sees violence. And while the White Lotus character I just pointed out right here did appear in DC's Manhunter relaunch post Zero Hour, that character, this series, as far as I've been able to determine, does not happen in the main continuity of DC. It is entirely a separate creation. I believe Fleisher and Giarrano did have a creator participation deal with the characters, which is probably why you've never seen him again. You think like something like this would be like one of be a catnip to Jeff Johns. But no, the 3 issues are inked by Kyle Baker, and honestly, they look like Kyle Baker drawn comics. These issues, like he's got a very thick line. 1988 Kyle Baker, and funnily enough, this series is happening at the same time as the Baker and Helfer's run on, and writer Andrew Helfer's run on The Shadow, which is one of the most amazing comics you will ever read. And honestly, I should cover that someday. The majority of the comic issues were inked by Jose Marzan Jr., which was, I believe, his first big work for the Big Two. You know, a veteran comic book inker. did probably best known for his runs on the Flash and Why the Last Man. But I don't want to spoil this series because part of the enjoyment of it is how wacky it gets. Because I'm not entirely sure Fleischer had a real idea of where he was going. It like there are lots of like they do something that I find interesting. It's not so much about what Haywire's doing is how everyone's trying to take advantage of what Haywire's doing. They sent the Yakuza tries to get involved, the government tries to get involved, the mafia gets involved. Because Steve Majorski's father was a mob boss, as you find out later on. Although the opening is kind of obvious. There are weird vigilantes and a woman who I think is just dressing up in a BDSM costume and running around for fun, trying to like take advantage of Haywire, use Haywire to their own ends, but Haywire can't be controlled really. And as the series goes on, it gets weirder and weirder. And the color work, nobody ever talks about the color work in this series. Especially, I believe, Bill Ray did the majority of the color. And it turns out to be one of the weirdest looking. It is really just for an action comic where guys are flying around, smashing things and blowing stuff up. It looks almost like surreal sometimes the way it's colored, and there's a minute the series goes on. It gets more and more minimalist, and that works in its favor though because it's sort of the simplicity of the artwork sort of like helps balance out the complexity of what starts going on, because it's not that it's so much it's good, it gets so convoluted because they got to work in the real origin of Haywire, the fact that Alex Kingman, Steve Majorski, and Haywire may not be the only people inside this person's head. And then there's a guy who steals his own robot suit to go after Haywire. And then there's another guy who steals his own robot suit. It does wrap up. It does wrap up satisfactorily. I wouldn't say perfectly, but satisfactorily in the 13th issue. And actually, by the time you get to the 13th issue, you're kind of relieved. Because so much has happened at that point. You're like, okay, just wrap it up. And it's one of the more dark, even for a DC comic in 1989, it's extremely dark how it all ends up. But something I always thought was, and this is going to be a slight spoiler, but this does come up with another comic I've read. Here is what's the final image of the 13th issue. Now, in 2003, before he left DC, Andrew Helfer was working on a series, a line for DC called Focus, which would be more like, for lack of a better term, superpowers in the real world. There was John Francis Moore and Wes Craig's Touch, Kelly Puckett and Warren Cleese's Kinetic, Steve Gerber and Brian Hurd's Hard Time, which was supposed to be the big book of the line, and that's the one that lasted the longest. But Helfer left the series before he got to the last, before the series launched. But as you can see, at the area of Haywire, a bunch of people find a green robot suit in a storage locker. In the beginning of Fraction, a bunch of people find a green robot suit in a storage locker. Now again, Helfer is only credited as special thanks on this series because he left the DC before it launched. But I always thought that was a pretty remarkable coincidence. Also, I plan to cover Fraction which is a very different, more coherent book, more satisfying book than uh, Haywire, but it's not as memorable as Haywire. But I do plan to cover it in the future. Haywire isn't even really talked about among people who are in it. Michael Fleisher. Not that there are any people into Michael Fleisher. Mostly Spectre and Jonah Hex is what people talk about when they talk about Michael Fleisher. The only creator who's ever spoke of an influence is Michel Fifth, who's a huge Giarrano fan, and Haywire was a direct inspiration of one of the characters in Capra, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But it's weird. don't want to talk about this series too much because I want you to discover it for yourself. I mean, I was lucky enough to get the entire series signed by Giarrano and the issues Baker inked by Baker. Hopefully, if I'm up to do any more conventions this year, I'll be able to track down Mr. Marzan. Of course, again, Mr. Fleischer passed away a few years ago. But you can find this thing in the quarter bins. You can find it super cheap. I highly recommend Haywire. It is 13 issues. It will cost you probably less than $20 to read its entirety, and it is a blast. You will not ever read anything quite like it right now or probably ever. Is it good? No. Is it memorable? Yes. Well, no, that's not fair. It is good, but it's not good in the way you normally think. It's good because it is nonstop. It is relentless. It throws everything at you and doesn't leave a thing on the table. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Haywire. This is Deadpool Negative, and I will see you next time.